Why is it necessary to give your all to Allah? Again, please shed some light on this by using examples. Why is it necessary to give your all to Allah?
I think for many reasons. One, you can talk about it firstly in terms of what if we don't? What will become of us? And when we do, what happens to us? And I think if you think about it, by the mere fact that we have declared the Shahada and we have entered into Islam, in a sense, obligates us to want to be able to do things that will please Him. So from the very beginning, earning the pleasure of Allah becomes something that it's a vision and a goal that we have in mind, and that's really the vision of the believer. The believer, when he thinks about his life and what his mission is, and everything that he does, he is certainly trying to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So part of that, in a sense, we can say contractual obligation that we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that of giving and that of sacrificing, because in essence, what we have is not, it doesn't belong to us. We are custodians of what we have. We are people who, this is an amana, it's a trust. And what we think that belongs to us, or when we think that we have something, whether it be our time, our person, our resources, we might think that we earn it, but rarely have we. And where did it come from? And ultimately it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one is that of, it's a contractual obligation. And as I mentioned before, built into the idea of Shahada is that of bearing witness. And bearing witness means that, you have to begin that process of giving all to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because ultimately He's the one that we are all responsible to. We're going to go back to Him, and we are going to be asked about everything that we do in this world. I think the other thing I wanted to mention is that when we think about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked us to do, even from the pillars of faith, or we think about our prayer or fasting, all of the things that we are obligated to do, we begin to realize that all of those are what we can describe as being means towards an end. And that in a sense, when we think about praying, it's not an act that is something which is done merely as an act, but it is something which has a higher motive and higher intention and higher purpose, and that being to earn the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in a sense, what we're saying is that when we do all of those things, it prepares us to do something else. So the real worship or the real ibadah is not necessarily just in the prayer or in the fasting, but the real worship and ibadah comes afterwards, when we have to learn the lessons of what we have done and then begin to put that into practice. Now, I wanted to mention some things because sometimes they can be a point of, let's say, a clash in terms of when we think about doing things for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and doing things, and where does our ego fit into the whole thing? Because sometimes it's when you do things for let's say we engage in Islamic activity, there are some things we feel good about ourselves. We are able to make friends, we're able to do what it is that we do. Sometimes people they applaud us for what we have done. So there's those things which also involved our ego in a sense. But then we need to know how does that fit in terms of gaining the pleasure of Allah? Because sometimes everything that you do may not necessarily have one intent. It could be multiple intents. And one might be that of, well, I'm doing something which will help our community. But another intent might be, well, if I get involved in this, then the community will know me. I might be able to, help myself in other ways. So it's something to think about. and that brings into the whole question what the Quran talks about, in that of ikhlas, or sincerity, and doing something which has multiple motives is something which we need to be really careful about. And as much as it might help us in one way, we need to always be focused on reminding ourselves what is the central motive in doing what it is that we do. And one of the examples that I can draw from the Quran is one where there was some amongst the amongst the Quraysh who were thinking to themselves, well, why don't we, the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, wants us to do certain things. So he wants us to worship in a particular way. And they were keen to become Muslims, but then they also had this attachment to the idols. So they were thinking to themselves, well, we can worship this God of Muhammad, upon whom be peace, worship him, but we can also worship our idols at the same time. And therefore, if there is some good to be derived from that form of worship, then we will benefit from it. And if our idols can still help us in any way, we would not have displeased them, which is really interesting in terms of the way that they were looking at it. Well, let's get the best of both worlds. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was very defiant in the Quran in the response to this particular attitude, saying that he does not accept anything which is divided in its nature, that what he accepts is something which is done wholly and for him and for him alone. That if it's divided, then it's done for another entity, and but there is no reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think it's something to think about, while we engage in what we do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rizza. Thank you for the examples as well.